Hi, I'm Gene Allen. On June the 6th, 1949, when Channel 4 went on the air for the very first time, I was in summer school at Oklahoma A&M in Stillwater and working as a copywriter at KSPI Radio in Stillwater. I didn't know anybody who owned a television set, but it sounded really interesting. It was in all the papers. And I discovered that downtown Stillwater at one of the hardware stores, they had a television set in the window. So I walked down to Main Street and stood outside the window after hours, they were closed, and looked at this, probably a 12-inch black and white TV set. Couldn't hear the sound, of course. It was inside the store and I was outside. But I thought that was really something. It was radio with pictures, and that really sounded like a big deal to me. I decided then and there that if possible, I'd like to work in that field somehow. When fall semester came, I was taking the only radio course that was offered at Oklahoma A&M at the time, and our teacher took us on a field trip to the studios in Oklahoma City, which were then in the Little Theater. A fraternity brother of mine, Nick Panis, was the art director on the staff at that time, and so we got a tour of the whole place, and once again, it really was something that looked like it'd be very exciting and a great place to work. So when I got back to Stillwater, I sat down and wrote an application letter, sent it off, and absolutely nothing happened. So I finished school, graduating there in 1950, and stayed on at KSPI writing radio copy. I had gone back to my home in Missouri for a long weekend, and during that time, Paul Bronner, who was the radio program director, was trying to get in touch with me. Of course, I wasn't home, so I wasn't picking up the phone. But he was very accommodating kind of guy, and when I got back home in Stillwater, here was a telegram in the door. It said, if you're still interested, give me a call, which of course I immediately did. And he asked me to come down for an interview. So I drove down to Oklahoma City. At that time, the WKY studios were in the Skirvin Tower. And I parked the car, walked down to the studios, and the Skirvin Hotel across the street at that time had a shoe shine stand in the basement. And I thought, well, I need to put on the best possible face, or foot, if you will. I've got to sell this deal. So I got myself a shoe shine, walked across up to the studios, identified myself, sat down and waited, and a little nervously, I must say. Mr. Bronner came out, went back to his office. We talked for about perhaps 15 minutes, and he offered me the job, which I immediately accepted. Showed me around the studios. To my absolute total amazement, there were 5 people who did nothing but write for that radio station. Today, that's, of course, ridiculous. No station does that, but WKY Radio at that time had a rule that everything that went on the air had to be written. The only exception was Danny Williams' Time and Tune Parade, which was an early morning disc jockey show. Everything else had to be written. And that's what these 5 writers did. There weren't so many advertising agencies at that time. They weren't as prominent as they later became. So a lot of the copy that came directly from the advertisers came through our typewriters. And it was the music director would send in a list of music that was to be played on any given program. And then we were supposed to write introductions for it, and the announcers read off the copy. None of this ad-libbing. So that's what I did. The first, well, the new guy on the block in the writers group always got the worst possible assignments, and the one they gave me was a polka parade that was done on Saturday afternoons. It was a request show, and the listeners would send in, would you please play Blue Skirt Polka or something like that. on a postcard, and then you'd incorporate that in the script. The problem was that most of the people who were writing in didn't have really good handwriting, and besides that, they all had Czech names, most of which didn't seem to have any vowels. And it was kind of a challenge to decipher the handwriting and then put a phonetic pronouncement in so that the poor announcer who was doing this would have some hope of getting through it. But that was always given to the new guy. Well, my job was writing radio copy, but like everybody else in WKY radio, I was burning up to get into television. And I finally got a writing assignment for Sooner Shindig, which was probably, I guess, the major live musical program they did at that time. It was a combination of country, western, and pop, and all of that. It was a pretty good sized show for that little theater studio. So that was a big thrill to be able to write the script for that. After that, I took a trip one weekend out to Britton Road to look at the new studio, which was being under construction at that time, and ran into Jack Lovell, who was chief engineer. So he offered to give me a tour, which I thought was very gracious of him. And we started walking around different places. We were in the two big TV studios, and I looked up and saw that the walls, the ceiling, everywhere was covered with a copper mesh. I asked him about that. He said, well, this is it's kind of unusual. Nobody has ever built a television studio right next door to an AM radio transmitter. And we don't know what might happen, whether those signals will get into the circuitry of the TV cameras or what. So we are electronically isolating this entire studio complex with this copper mesh. I'm sure it was really expensive. It's still there, by the way. So time went on, and in September of 1951, we moved to radio and TV out to that Britton Road Studios. Now we were all together, and my desire to get into television was even more intense. And I talked to Joe Jerkins, who was one of the directors at that time, and wanted to know if I couldn't get out of radio copy and get into TV somehow. In my rather juvenile mind, I thought I wanted to be a director, the guy who sits up in the studio and punches the buttons and tells everybody what to do. That sounded to me like the ultimate. So at that time, there was a rule that if you were going to be a director, go into training for that, you had to first go through training on stage crew. You had to learn how to light and how to run the cameras and all of that stuff. Well, that was fine with me, and I managed to wrangle a transfer from copywriting into the studio work. It was they were very particular about their video pictures at that time. Most TV stations in that era just simply put up some fluorescent lights and what they call flat lighting everybody, but that wasn't good enough for Channel 4. They went to Hollywood and bought a bunch of focused lights and a lot of other equipment that really went with the movie industry. And we had to learn how to light, three-point lighting, a key and a fill and a backlight. My first assignment, very first assignment on stage, I was assigned to a music program on Saturday night. I think it was Jane Hall and Al Tell playing piano, and a director who really had visions of grandeur about what we could do about this. So I was assigned to push a dolly. Now the dolly was called a Sanner crane, and it was also imported from Hollywood. It was quite a nice piece of equipment, a four-wheel dolly with a big boom, and the camera and the camera operator sat at the end of this boom, and then the poor soul who was assigned to push this thing around had a steering wheel at the back, and the thing was heavy and it was hard to push. I didn't know when I went in that night that was going to be my assignment. I was wearing a pair of leather-soled shoes, and there was no way I could keep pushing that thing and gain any kind of traction with those leather shoes. It was a long night for me. Eventually, I got a chance to do some actual directing. This was the sign-on shift, of course, the one that nobody wanted. And it was a fairly simple 2-camera shoot, news, weather, and the farm show. But I had hardly gotten started on that when I got a letter from the President of the United States suggesting that really what I needed to do was join the Army, which of course I didn't want to do at all, and it was pretty much put out. It was during the Korean War. But when the President calls, of course, you know, you can't say no. So I ended up in the Army at Fort Bliss, Texas for 2 years. And that was the time when television was just arriving to El Paso. There were 2 stations. KROD was a CBS station, KTSM was NBC. They were in a mad race to see who could be first on the air. The CBS station had very nice facilities and a good staff. Unfortunately, they didn't have anybody on staff who had ever directed a live program. I was down there for some reason in my Army duties and was talking to the program director and mentioned that I had been at WKY and that I didn't tell him how little I directed, but I told him I'd done live directing. So they hired me in the evenings to do the 10 o'clock news grouping. And I also directed the sign-on program. So one of my most famous things that I can talk about is I directed the first television program in El Paso. I don't know what that's worth to the world, but anyway, I did. And got into a regular Monday through Friday directing shift. The Army was kind enough to let me do that. It was an interesting experience. The guy who did the news was the news director at the CBS station there. He thought that if he was going to be on television news, it ought to be something distinctive. So he wore a Walter Winchell snap brim hat and tried to do a sort of a Walter Winchell impression. One problem with him was that he only had one good eye, and I didn't know that for a while. I kept cueing him from the wrong side and getting no results at all. Finally, I figured it out. But in that period of time, I realized that I didn't want to be a director at all. Directing is a real high-pressure kind of job, and I don't do high pressure that well. Basically a writer, and after a while, I decided that it was a valuable experience, and it probably was the one thing that kept me from dying at age 25. Got out of the Army. I was ready to come back to Channel 4. Wrote them a letter, told them I was getting out of the Army, and they had said, when your time's up, let us know and we'll find something for you to do. And they did. Frank McGee was on the news staff at that time. He went on to a long, very great career with NBC News. And they were starting a program called Aftermath. This was the assistant manager, Hoyt Andre's idea, a real genius, by the way, in television. And it was a good idea. What he wanted to do was to go back and do programs, do stories about people who had been in the news a month, a year, 10 years, whatever we could dig up, and find out what happened to them and how that story played out in the long run. It was a great idea, and they assigned me to be a cameraman for Frank, and also do a little bit of the writing, although he did most of it. I had sort of taught myself to shoot 16 millimeter film in the Army, and I wasn't as experienced as probably everybody thought at the station, but I figured I'd learn it as I went, which I did. Most all of us did that. Well, Aftermath was really a brilliant programming idea. The only problem was it was 5 nights a week, 15 minutes, and Frank and I were the only people producing it. It was insanity, actually. We were working all that summer through 12-hour days, 16-hour days, 7 days a week, trying to keep up with the stupid thing. And finally, at the end of that summer, Frank went in and said, I can't do this anymore, I quit. And the company had just bought a station in Montgomery, Alabama, and they offered him the news director job if he wouldn't quit. He took it and left. I stayed on with Aftermath for a little while longer with another partner until finally it just crashed of its own weight. Frank got to Montgomery, Alabama just as Rosa Parks was getting on the bus, and that was the key to his future at NBC News. I went back in the news rotation, shooting news stories on the street, writing scripts, that sort of thing. And that went on for, probably a year or two. In 1954, another cameraman joined the station, a fellow by the name of Scott Berner. And he'd been a still photographer in Mississippi, but nobody was asking too many questions in those days about how much movie experience you had, so we all learned it together. Dick John, who was the news director, called me and Scott in one day and said, we would like to organize a documentary crew, and we want you two to do it. And we said, okay, what do you want us to do? And to our astonishment, he said, well, you figure out what ought to be done, keep us informed, let us know, get to work and start doing some documentaries. Well, we thought we'd died and gone to heaven. I mean, how great an assignment is that, to actually be given the freedom, probably unheard of today, to do whatever you think ought to be done. One of the things that we thought would be a good thing, we were both interested in preserving Oklahoma history. We had heard about a newsreel photographer in the state back in the 1920s and 30s, the name of Benny Kent, out of Chandler. Johnny Shannon, the photographer at the station, had told us about Benny. And somewhere he had saved all of this 35 millimeter newsreel film that he shot, plus a lot of other stuff that he shot. He'd covered everything that moved in Oklahoma from about 1918 on to 1945. The film was supposedly, it existed somewhere, but nobody knew what had happened to it. Benny had died, and we looked rather extensively for it, and we just couldn't come up with any clues at all what might have happened. We found out later that Benny had tried to sell it to the city of Oklahoma City, to this place and that place, and nobody was interested. And eventually Lou Wentz, an oil man in Ponca City, had bought it for an unknown amount. He didn't know what to do with it either, but he put it in a corner of his office. In those days, 35 millimeter film was on what's called a nitrate base. It's no longer used. It's one of the reasons you can't smoke in movie theaters, because nitrate-based film not only burned, it almost exploded when exposed to a flame, and in the process of burning gave off poison gas. So somebody told Lou Wentz what he had in his office, and maybe he ought to get rid of it, and he gave it to Oklahoma State University. They didn't know what to do with it either. They put it in the projection booth at the college auditorium, and there it sat for years and years. And somehow or another, I can't remember now how, we found out where it was. We went up, and there it was. Can after can after can of this film, which was the history of Oklahoma from in that period. We couldn't believe our good luck. And then we found out that about half of it had already deteriorated so badly that it just was gone. It made you want to cry, all of the governor's inaugurations, all the things that happened in Oklahoma. But we talked the university into letting us have it on the promise that we would get it, any of it we could, we'd get on safety film, 16 millimeter, and we'd give them a copy, and we'd use the rest of it for documentaries. We put it in the trunk of the car, in the back seat of the car, and drove it back to the station. And the stuff smelled pretty bad. It was sort of like dirty feet, if that's the best way I can explain it. So when we took it in the station, there were some comments about this smell. We said we'll get it out of here as soon as we can. We didn't tell them what we really had and the dangers that we had with fire, but we started going through it. A lot of it we had to throw away. Some of it we sent to Hollywood for a special print job because it had shrunk and the sprocket holes no longer matched up with the standard 35 millimeter projector. Eventually we got enough material to do, I believe, 12 documentaries on Oklahoma history. These were, they're pretty successful. They won awards from the Western Heritage Center. We were actually, with one of them, we were nominated for an Emmy. We didn't win it. Some station in Philadelphia, I believe, won it with a documentary on the plight of old people, which we always thought was just more East Coast bias against what we were doing out here in the heartland. But the station got even with them the next year when George Wesley, Bob Dodson, and Oliver Murray won the Emmy for their documentary Through a Looking Glass Darkly. About that time, Scott got a call from Frank McGee at NBC News. He was being given a 30-minute documentary slot prime time on NBC, and he wanted Scott and me to come up and join the party. I didn't go because I had 3 little girls and responsibilities back here, and I couldn't see moving to New York City. Scott, however, he took off and had a long career with NBC News. And I went back into the general run of news, and it was a pretty good life. About that time, Joe Jerkins asked if I would be interested in doing weather, which I thought was kind of odd, but since I didn't have any formal meteorological training, but they were pretty desperate. They normally had 3, obviously they were desperate. They normally had 3 meteorologists on staff, and somebody had resigned, and they needed somebody to fill in the early morning shift. And so Joe had me cut an audition, which I have to say was really, really bad. But he was a real good guy, and he worked with me, and so I started doing early morning weather in addition to what I was doing on news. I guess I learned enough to stay out of trouble. I think my finest moment was one early morning in the wintertime when I forecast flow flurries instead of snow flurries. In the early morning shift, we had a director named Billy Nix, who was quite a comedian. We also had a fellow by the name of John Spence, who was running camera on that shift. I was doing weather, and we had a series of cue lights that were used off camera to tell me when it was time to break for a commercial. Well, Billy, he thought it would be really funny to see if he could break me up on the air. There was some construction going on in the studio. There was an electric jackhammer off to one side. And Billy's plan was to plug this jackhammer into an electrical outlet, and then just before the camera came to me, while I was still off camera, he would hit this jackhammer, make a terrible racket, and then he would switch to me and just see what happened, you know. What he didn't know was that the jackhammer outlet was also the same electrical circuit that the cue lights were on. So I'm going along doing the weather. He gives me a spot cue. The jackhammer goes off just as loud as you can possibly imagine. I'm told that I looked at the camera and said, well, I guess it's time for a commercial. I don't remember that. I think I blacked the whole thing out. But everybody in the studio, I guess including me, had a great laugh over that. One of the nice things about working at Channel 4 and WKY Radio, for that matter, one of the nice things about working there was you were able to do all kinds of things. And anything you were big enough to do, you usually could do. I worked, as I said, not only early morning weather, but when the farm directors were out of town, I took a turn at doing the farm program early morning. At one time, I worked with the football crew. We were doing simulcast radio and television, and I was a coordinator between the two. Bob Berry, Jack Ogle, famous names in sports, of course, were the ones we were working with. They had been working down at OU doing the OU football games for a long time, and something happened. I never knew exactly what, but I think part of it was that WKY Radio lost the rights in a bidding war with KTOK for those football games, and Bob and Jack ended up doing OSU football, and once again it was a simulcast with radio and TV. And we were down at Norman, the final game of the year. We hadn't, OSU, I say we because I went to OSU. OSU hadn't beaten OU in a very long time. And the game was close. And right at the very last of it, the quarterback threw a pass into the end zone. The OSU player caught it, and they won the game. Bob Berry punched the off button on his mic. In a very loud voice said, "Take that, you so-and-sos." What he didn't realize was the crowd mic was right outside his window and it picked it up. And we all had a laugh about that. I think when they did the playbacks on television, they came in and took that little exclamation part out. Anyway, most people don't know it ever happened. Way back in 1949, when I first saw that black and white TV set in the window of a store in Stillwater, I always thought this is what I wanted to do, and I thought this was the place I wanted to be. It was a great ride, a great place to work, great people, and I pretty much loved every minute of it.